The throne room of the kingdom had never felt so cold, so heavy with dread, as it did on the fateful night when everything the court believed about their sovereign would crumble into dust and ash. The great house stretched before them, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadow, the torches along the stone walls flickering as though even fire itself feared what was about to unfold. At the center of it all stood Morgana, the queen consort whose name was whispered with equal parts reverence and terror throughout the realm, her dark hobbies billowing around her like living smoke, her eyes fixed upon the ancient seal that had been carved into the marble floor centuries before any of them had drawn breath. King Alfa sat upon his throne, his fingers gripping the armrests with such force that his knuckles had turned white, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his face twitched and pulsated. He knew what she was about to do. He had always known this moment would come, had dreaded it through every passing season, through every false smile and hollow ceremony, through every night he lay awake listening to the wind howl through the castle towers like the screams of the damned. The seal itself was a masterwork of forbidden craft, inscribed with symbols that predated the written language of the kingdom, marks that seemed to shift erase when observed too long, as though they existed not merely on the surface of the stone but in some deeper, darker dimension that bled through into the world of fleshy breath. For generations, the royal family had guarded this seal, had told themselves and their children that each contained something ancient and terrible, something that must never be released, but none of them had truly understood what lay beneath. None except Alfa, who had inherited not just the crown but the terrible knowledge that came with each, the burden of truth that had aged him beyond his years and carved deep lines into his face like scars from invisible battles. Morgana had spent years piecing together fragments of the truth, gathering whispers from forgotten texts in tortured confessions, following threads of conspiracy in deceit that wound through the very foundations of the throne itself. She had been patient, meticulous, waiting for the perfect moment when the court would be assembled, when every noble and advisor and servant would bear witness to what she was about to reveal. The ceremony had been called under the pretense of celebrating the harvest moon, a tradition as old as the kingdom itself, but Morgana had orchestrated every detail with the precision of a master weaving an intricate spell. The entire court stood in attendance, hundreds of faces turned toward the throne in anticipation of the usual rituals and proclamations, unaware that they had been summoned not to celebrate but to witness the unraveling of everything they thought they knew. Among them stood Lord Vesper, the king's most trusted advisor, whose silver tongue had guided policy in politics for decades, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with suspicion. He had sensed something shifting in the undercurrents of power, had felt Morgana's influence growing like frost creeping across stone, and though he had tried to counsel the king against allowing her too much freedom, his warnings had gone unheeded. Now he stood rigidly watchful, one hand resting near the hilt of the ceremonial dagger at his belt, a weapon that had never tasted blood but might soon break that innocence. Lady Serafini occupied her place among the high nobles, her beauty legendary throughout the realm, but beneath her porcelain features lay a mind as calculating as any generalesse, and she had long harbored ambitions that reached beyond her current station. She watched Morgana with barely concealed fascination, recognizing in the queen a kindred spirit who refused to be contained by the limitations others sought to impose. Serafini had her own secrets, her own plans that depended upon the careful maintenance of the status quo, and any disruption to the established order represented both threat and opportunity. Her fingers played absently with the ruby pendant at her throat, a gift from the king himself during a time when his favor had been easier to earn, before Morgana had claimed not just his bed but his very soul. Commander Thorne stood at attention near the main entrance, his armor polished to mirror brightness, his hand never straying far from his sword. He was a soldier first and always, a man who had built his life upon the bedrock of duty and loyalty to the crown, in the tension radiating through the house, city, every instinct screaming that battle was imminent. But this would be no clash of steel and shield, no enemy that could be defeated with strength and courage, in that uncertainty gnawed at him like a poison. He had fought alongside Alpha in campaigns that had forged the kingdom's borders, had saved the king's life more than once, he earned his absolute trust. Yet even Thorn had noticed how his sovereign had changed over the years, how shadows seemed to cling to him in ways that had nothing to do with light or darkness in any ordinary sense. Morgana raised her hands slowly, deliberately, in the murmur of conversation that had filled the house died away as though she had reached out and strangled the very air. Her voice when she spoke carried throughout the space with a natural clarity, each word seeming to bypass theirs entirely and manifest directly in the minds of those assembled, a trick of power that sent shivers racing those spines, erased the thin hairs on the backs of necks. She spoke of secrets and lies, of foundations built upon deception, of a truth so terrible that each had been buried beneath ritual and tradition for longer than anyone living could remember. She spoke of the seal beneath their feet, that ancient mark of binding and imprisonment, and she told them that what lay trapped within was not some external horror from the depths of the world, a void beyond the stars, but something far more intimate, far more devastating. The shadow beast that had been sealed away, she declared, was born from the Kigi himself, spawned from his very essence, a manifestation of the darkness that ran through his bloodline like a river of corruption. Alpha did not rise from his throne or cry out in denial. He sat frozen, a statue of Amma, knowing that every word Morgana spoke was true, that the moment he had dreaded through countless sleepless nights had finally arrived. The lineage of kings had carried this curse for generations, each monarch forced their face the terrible knowledge that they were not merely rulers of men but vessels for something ancient and hungry, something that fed upon power and fear in the suffering of those who bent the knee. The seal had been created by the first Alpha, the founder of the dynasty, who had made a bargain in the darkness before the kingdom's birth, trading his humanity for the strength to carve an empire from chaos in blood. Each successor inherited not just the crown but the shadow that came with each, the beast that lived beneath their skin and whispered their thoughts, urging them toward cruelty and conquest, toward decisions that served not the people but the insatiable appetite of the thing that wore their face. Morgana had discovered this truth slowly, painfully, through years of watching her husband, through nights when she felt something else looking out from behind his eyes, through moments when his voice carried harmonics that belonged to no human throat. She had loved him once, had believed in the man she had married, but that love had curdled into something far more complex as she realized the depth of the deception that had been woven around the throne. The king was not evil by choice but by inheritance, cursed to struggle against an influence that grew stronger with each passing year, with each exercise of royal authority, with each life taken in the name of order and justice. The seal did not contain the beast, she explained, her voice ringing with terrible certainty, but rather suppressed each, pushed each down into the deepest parts of Alpha's being where each could be partially controlled, partially denied, but never truly destroyed. The court listened in growing horror as Morgana laid bare the conspiracy that had sustained the kingdom for centuries. The royal advisors had known, had always known, passing the knowledge from one generation to the next like a poisoned inheritance. They had helped each king maintain the illusion of humanity, had crafted laws and customs designed to channel the beast's influence in ways that appeared righteous and necessary, had fed each with carefully orchestrated wars and executions and purges that were framed as essential to the realm's survival. Lord Vesper's face had gone pale as milk, his carefully maintained composure cracking as he realized that Morgana had uncovered everything, had seen through the elaborate machinery of deceit that he and his predecessors had constructed. The revelation did not just expose the king's curse but implicated every advisor, every high noble, every keeper of tradition who had participated in the great lie. Lady Serafini's reaction was different, her eyes widening not with shock but with a kind of hungry understanding. She had suspected that power in the kingdom flowed from some deeper source, had sensed that those who rose highest did so by aligning themselves with currents that ran beneath the visible surface of politics protocol. Now she understood the true nature of those currents, and her mind was already racing ahead, calculating how this knowledge could be leveraged, what opportunities might emerge from the chaos that Morgana was unleashing. Commander Thorne, by contrast, looked as though he had been struck a physical blow, his soldier's certainty shattered by the realization that he had devoted his life to serving not a mer but a monster, that every battle fought, every enemy slain had fed the very darkness that threatened to consume everything he held dear. Morgana moved toward the scene with slow, deliberate steps, her hands beginning to glow with an eerie light that cast writhing shadows across the throne room floor. She spoke of her own journey into the forbidden arts, of the years she had spent mastering powers that the kingdom's mages had deemed too dangerous to pursue, all in preparation for this moment. The other practitioners of magic in the realm worked within carefully prescribed boundaries, their gifts focused on healing and illumination in the gentle manipulation of natural forces, but Morgana had delved into deeper, darker territories, had learned to touch the spaces between things, to reach into the void where reality frayed and unraveled the threads that held spells and beads together. She had become what the ancient texts called a shadow walker, one who could move through the darkness between heartbeats, who could see the true shapes of things hidden beneath their mundane appearances. The seal began to crack, thin lines of brilliant white light breaking through the ancient symbols as Morgana's power pressed against the binding that had held for so long. The temperature in the throne room plummeted, frost forming on metal surfaces, breath misty the suddenly frigid air. Alpha finally moved, rising from his throne with a sound that might have been a word, might have been something far less human, his body rigid with the effort of containing what was stirring within him. Those nearest the throne stepped back instinctively, sensing the change that was overtaking their king, seeing how his shadow on the wall behind him seemed to grow larger and darker, developing contours that did not match his physical form. The beast was waking, responding to the weakening of the seal, and Alpha's struggle to maintain control was written in every trembling muscle and white-knuckled fist. Morgana did not stop, did not hesitate, driving her power deeper into the seal's structure until the cracks widened into chasms of burning light. She knew what would happen when the binding failed completely, knew the danger she was courting, but this was the only way to force the truth into the open where each could no longer be denied or hidden. The kingdom had been built on a foundation of darkness, and as long as that foundation remained hidden, the corruption would continue, generation after generation, king after cursed king perpetuating a cycle of controlled monstrosity dressed up as righteous rule. Only by exposing the beast, by dragging it into the light where everyone could see it, could there be any hope of breaking the cycle, of finding a way to purge the castle at least acknowledge its existence openly. The seal shattered with a sound like reality itself tearing, a darkness erupted from the broken binding like water from a burst dam, but this was no ordinary shadow. It was alive, writhing, reaching with appendages that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human perception could fully comprehend. The darkness flowed across the floor in all directions, climbing the walls, extinguishing torches, swallowing light wherever it touched. Screams erupted from the assembled court as nobles and servants alike scrambled backward, pressing against walls and each other in their desperation to escape the spreading tide of shadow. But the darkness was not seeking them, not yet, for each had only one true destination, one vessel that had been prepared across generations to receive each fully and completely. Alpha threw his head back and howled, a sound that contained notches never meant to emerge from a human throat, and his body convulsed as the shadow beast poured into him, no longer suppressed or contained but surging through every fiber of his being with the force of a dam breaking. His skin darkened, taking on a texture like burnt parchment, and his eyes went completely black, reflecting nothing, absorbing all night that touched them. His fingers elongated into claws that scraped against stone, and his teeth lengthened into fangs designed for rending and tearing. The transformation was not complete, not yet, for some part of Alpha still fought against it, still struggled to maintain his humanity even as the beast claimed more and more territory within the battlefield of his flesh. The king and the monster existed in terrible harmony, each aspect visible in the thing that stood before the throne, neither fully dominant, locked in a conflict that distorted reality around them. Lord Vesper drew his ceremonial dagger, though what he intended to do with such an inadequate weapon against what stood before them was unclear. Perhaps it was simply instinct, the need to have steely hand when facing monsters, or perhaps he recognized that the time for maintaining illusions had passed and only direct action remained. He shouted orders to the guards stationed throughout the hall, calling for them to protect the nobles, to evacuate the court, but his voice was nearly lost in the chaos of screaming and stampeding bodies. Some guards obeyed, forming defensive lines and shepherding panicked courtiers toward the exits, while others stood frozen in shock or dropped their weapons and fled themselves, overwhelmed by the impossibility of what they were witnessing. Lady Serafini did not run but instead pushed forward, fighting against the tide of fleeing bodies, her eyes fixed upon Morgana with intensity that bordered on obsession. She understood that the queen held knowledge that went beyond this moment, beyond the immediate horror of the beast as he released, and that knowledge lay power that Serafini craved more than safety or comfort or even life itself. She had spent years positioning herself at the edges of the kingdom as greatest secrets, gathering fragments and hints, and now she saw an opportunity to claim the full truth, to learn what Morgana knew about the working of deep magic and the manipulation of curses that ran through bloodlines like poison through veins. Commander Thorne rallied those guards who had maintained their composure, forming them into a protective cordon around the exits to ensure that the evacuation proceeded with some semblance of order. His military training served him well even in the face of supernatural horror, giving him concrete tasks to focus upon rather than allowing paralysis or despair to claim him. He barked commands in a voice that cut through the chaos, organizing defensive positions, designating soldiers to guide groups of nobles to safety, maintaining the framework of duty and discipline that had defined his entire life. But even as he worked, his eyes kept returning to the transformed king, to the monster that had worn the face of the man he had sworn to serve, and something fundamental was breaking inside him, some core belief about order and rightness in the nature of authority itself. The beast that was he was not Alpha moved away from the throne, its steps leaving scorch marks on the stone floor, reality itself seeming to burn wherever it touched. It turned its terrible gaze upon the assembled court, and those who met its eyes directly felt something reach into their minds, felt cold intelligence far older and more vast than any human consciousness examining them, weighing them, finding them wanting or useful or simply insignificant. The beast spoke, and its voice was Alpha-S voice layered with 1,000 others, echoes of every king who had carried the curse, every voice that had been consumed and incorporated into the collective darkness. It spoke of hunger and dominion, of the natural order where the strong devoured the weak and power was the only law that mattered, of kingdoms built on mountains of corpses and watered with rivers of blood. Morgana stood her ground as the beast advanced toward her, showing no fear though every survival instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to escape the attention of this thing she had released. She had prepared for this confrontation, had woven protections into her very being through years of painstaking ritual and sacrifice, had transformed herself into something more than merely human in order to face what the kings had become. The air around her shimmered with barely visible energy, words, e shields that existed not in physical space but in the layers of reality that underlie the world of matter in form. The beast could sense these protections, could taste the power that Morgana had claimed for herself, in something like recognition passed across its distorted features. The confrontation between Queenie Beast drew every eye that remained in the throne room. Those who had not yet fled or fainted or been trampled in the panic. This was the true revelation that Morgana had orchestrated, not merely exposing the Carsi but demonstrating that each could be confronted, that the darkness that had ruled the kingdom from behind the mask of legitimate authority could be challenged by one who was willing to claim power from the same deep sources. She spoke again, her voice cutting through the beast's growling pronouncements, and she told those assembled that the Carsi was not inevitable, that each had been created by choice, and fed by centuries of compromising collaboration, and that each could be made by those brave enough or desperate enough to pay the necessary price. The beast laughed, a sound like stones grinding together in the depths of the earth, and it told Morgana that she understood nothing, that the Carsi was woven into the very foundations of the kingdom, that to destroy it would be to tear down everything the realm had built, every structure of power, order, and civilization that separated them from the chaos of barbarism and savagery. The kingdom was the beast, and the beast was the kingdom, inseparable and eternal, and any attempt to divide them would result in the collapse of both. Alfa's voice occasionally broke through the layered cacophony, crying out in anguish as the men fought against the monster for control of their shared form, pleading with Morgana to restore the seal, to bind the darkness back down before it consumed him completely and left nothing but the beast wearing his empty skin. But Morgana shook her head, her expression hard with resolve born from years of painful understanding. She explained that the seal had been a cowardice solution, a way of managing the Carsi without truly confronting each, of allowing each generation to pretend that they were not complicit in the horror at the heart of their power. The beast had to be fully manifested, fully acknowledged, before each could be addressed. If that meant risking everything, including the kingdom itself, then so be it. Better to burn away the war completely than to let it continue festering beneath a veneer of respectability and tradition. She had studied the oldest texts, the ones that predated even the founding of the kingdom, and she had found references to rituals of purification that were supposed to be capable of burning out curses even as deeply rooted as this one, though the cost would be terrible in the outcome far from certain. Lord Vesper finally found his voice, shouting that Morgana was mad, that she was threatening to destroy everything their ancestors had built, that the kingdom needed the strength that came from the beast even if that strength carried a dark price. Better to continue as they had, he argued, managing the Carsi through careful control and channeling its influence toward purposes that served the realm's survival and prosperity, than to risk total annihilation in pursuit of some impossible purity. He had dedicated his life to maintaining the systems that had allowed the kingdom to thrive despite the corruption at its core, and he could not simply abandon that work, could not accept that everything he had done had been not merely compromised but fundamentally tainted from the beginning. Lady Serafini laughed at Vesper's protestations, her voice carrying clarity even through the continuing chaos. She declared that the advisor was a fool if he thought the Carsi had ever been truly controlled, that each had shaped every decision in policy for generations, that the entire structure of the kingdom was designed not to serve the people but to feed the beast's appetite while maintaining the illusion of benevolent rule. She had seen Nietzsche herself, had watched how those who rose to power did so by developing a taste for the kind of cruelty and domination that the Carsi demanded, how the court rewarded behavior that served the darkness while punishing those who resisted unquestioned. The kingdom was already a monster, she said, and Morgana was simply forcing everyone to see its true face. Commander Thorn moved closer to the confrontation, his sword now drawn, though he seemed uncertain what he could possibly do with it. He called out to Alfa, trying to reach the man beneath the beast, reminding him of battles fought together, of old sworn and kept, of the friendship that had existed before crowns and courses and impossible burdens. The beast turned its attention to Thorn, and for a moment something human flickered in those black eyes, some fragment of the Kigi who had once existed, who perhaps existed is Chewy some buried chamber of consciousness. Alfa's voice emerged more clearly, fighting through the layers of monstrous overtones, begging Thorn to take care of the kingdom if the worst should happen, to protect the people from the chaos that would inevitably follow if the throne stood empty or if some successor even more corrupted by the Cassie should claim it. Morgana began to chant in a language that predated all modern tongues, words that seemed to come not from her throat but from the air itself, from the stones beneath their feet, from the spaces between moments. Night began to gather around her, not the gentle illumination of candles or torches but something harsher, colder, more absolute. This was the light that existed before creation, before form and void separated into distinct states, each burned with an intensity that made even the beast recoil. The Cassie was darkness made manifest, shadow giving form and purpose, in this primordial light was its antithesis, its natural enemy in the eternal war between opposing forces that underlie all existence. The beast roared in defiance and pain as the light touched it, burning away layers of shadow like a morning sun burning mist from valleys. Alfa's human form became more visible beneath the darkness, his features reasserting themselves as the beast's hold weakened under the assault of Morgana's power. But the Cassie did not simply surrender or fade away peacefully, for it had been fed for too long, had grown too strong through centuries of being given everything it desired. It fought back with desperate fury, lashing out with tendrils of solid darkness that struck at Morgana's shields, testing them, probing for weaknesses that could be exploited. The throne room became a battlefield where light and shadow clashed with force that cracked stone and shattered ancient masonry, where reality itself seemed to strain under the weight of opposing powers. Those courtiers who had not yet fled pressed themselves against the walls or huddled behind overturned furniture, watching helpless the Horas their queen and their cursed king fought a war that transcended anything they had imagined possible. Some prayed to gods whose names had not been spoken in generations, while others simply wept or stared in shock, their minds unable to fully process what they were witnessing. A few, the ones whose ambition or curiosity outweighed their fear, watched with calculating intensity, already planning how they might turn this upheaval to their advantage, how they might position themselves to claim power in whatever new order emerged from the ruins of the old. The light grew brighter and hotter, and Morgana's body began to show signs of strain as she channeled forces that no human form was truly meant to contain. Blood ran from her nose and ears, and her skin took on a translucent quality as though she were becoming less solid, less anchored to the material world. The ritual she had invoked demanded sacrifice, payment for the power it granted, and she had always known that she would not survive its completion intact. But she had accepted the price years ago when she first understood the true nature of what she faced, when she realized that breaking the Cassie would require someone willing to burn themselves as fuel for the purifying fire. Alfa screamed as the light invaded him, burning through the darkness that had been woven into his very essence, cauterizing the connections that the Cassie had established over generations. The pain was beyond anything that could be described in words, beyond anything a human mind was designed to endure, yet he could not escape it, could not flee into unconsciousness or madness, for the light would not permit such mercy. It demanded that he remain present for every moment of the purification, that he feel every thread of darkness being torn from his being and consumed. Part of him wanted to surrender, they'll let the beast win, they'll sink back into the comfortable numbness of partial corruption rather than endure the agony of potential redemption. But another part, the Corey that remained stubbornly human despite everything, clung to the hope that Morgana as a terrible gamble might actually succeed. The beast as form began to separate from Alpha as body, peeling away like skin being shed by some vast serpent, though it did not release its grip easily or cleanly. Tendrils of shadow remained embedded in the Kigi, connected to his heart and mind and soul, severing those connections risked destroying him entirely. Morgana could see the danger, could sense how close Alpha was still simply fragmenting into pieces that could never be reassembled into a functional whole, but she did not relent or ease the pressure of her assault. The Kasi had to be fully extracted regardless of what it might cost the man who had carried it, for leaving even fragments behind would allow it to eventually regenerate and begin the cycle anew. Lord Vespa Magi Resmove, driven by decades of commitment to preserving the kingdom's systems at any cost. He lunged forward with his ceremonial dagger, not toward the beast the king but toward Morgana herself, aiming to disrupt her concentration and break the ritual before it could complete. He shouted that she was killing the kingdom, that without the power that came from the Kasi they would be vulnerable to every enemy at their borders, that she was trading certain survival for uncertain purity. But Commander Thorn intercepted him, sword flashing in the strange light, knocking the dagger from Vesper's hand and slamming the older man against the nearest wall with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. Thorn's face was grim, his expression that of a man who had made an impossible choice he would live with the consequences regardless of how they unfolded. He had decided, in that crucial moment, that he would rather serve a kingdom that faced its sins honestly than continue protecting one built on buried or rotting comfortable lies. Lady Samafini moved to Morgana's side, not to attack but to add her own power to the ritual, such as it was. She was no shadow walker, had not spent years preparing for this moment as Morgana had, but she possessed her own gifts, in her own understanding of how to shape reality through willing desire. She reached out and touched Morgana's shoulder, feeding her strength, her life force, helping to sustain the queen as the ritual consumed her from within. Samafini knew that this alliance might cost her everything, might mark her as either savior or destroyer depending on how events unfolded, but she had never been one to stand safely on the sidelines when history was being made. She whispered to Morgana, offering encouragement or perhaps simply bearing witness, ensuring that the queen would not face this final trial alone. The shadow beast made one last desperate attempt to maintain its hold, gathering all its remaining strength for a final assault. It manifested forms from nightmare, shapes from the collective unconscious of humanity as the darkest fears, horrors that should not exist but did because they had been fed and strengthened by centuries of royal cruelty disguised as necessary rule. These manifestations lunged at Morgana and Serafini, at Alpha who was caught between human and monster, at anyone and anything within reach. Guards who had maintained their positions were torn apart by claws that existed partially outside normal space, dying before they could even scream. Commander Thorn rallied his remaining soldiers, forming them into a last defensive line, buying Chimmy with their blood and courage even though they all understood that their weapons could barely touch what they faced. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the light reached critical intensity and the Kasi broke. The shadow beast was torn from Alpha with a sound like the world itself shrieking in protest, its form disintegrating under the relentless assault of primordial radiance. The darkness tried to flee, to find some cracky crevice where it could hide and survive, but Morgana and Samafini held it in place with their combined will, refusing to allow it any escape. The light consumed it entirely, burning away every trace of the Kasi that had plagued the kingdom since its founding, purifying the throne room and everyone in it with fire that existed beyond merely physical combustion. Alpha collapsed, his body reverting fully to human form, unconscious but breathing, alive but fundamentally changed by what he had endured. The parts of himself that had been intertwined with the Cassie were simply gone, burned away along with the darkness, leaving gaps in his psyche in soul that might never fully heal. He would spend the rest of his life dealing with the absence of aspects of himself that had been corrupted beyond redemption, learning to exist as a person diminished but finally, genuinely free. Morgana fell to her knees, blood flowing freely from every orifice as her body paid the price for channeling forces it was never meant to contain. The light faded from around her, and what remained was a woman who had given everything to break a curse that had enslaved generations. She looked up at Serafini with eyes that were already beginning to glaze, and she smiled, an expression of profound satisfaction despite the agony that racked her frame. She had done what she had set out to do, had forced the truth into the open and burned away the rod at the heart of the kingdom, and if the cost was her own life and perhaps the life of the man she had once loved, that was a price she had accepted from the beginning. Commander Thorne ordered his soldiers to secure the throne room and tend to the wounded, his voice somehow steady despite everything he had witnessed. Lord Vespansar slumped against the wall where Thorne had thrown him, staring at nothing, his entire worldview shattered beyond any hope of repair. Around them, the surviving members of the court began to emerge from their hiding places, looking upon a throne room that had been fundamentally transformed, where the seal that had hidden their greatest shame lay in ruins, and the king himself lay unconscious beside his dying queen. The kingdom would survive the night, would persist beyond this moment of revelation and violence, but each would never be the same. The truth had been exposed, witnessed by hundreds who would carry that knowledge out into the realm, spreading each through every town and village until everyone understood what had been done in the name of order and authority. The old systems of power would crumble, the advisors who had maintained the conspiracy would be swept aside, and something new would have to be built from the ruins. Whether that new order would be better or worse, whether the kingdom would grow stronger from honestly facing its cease or collapse under the weight of the terrible knowledge, remained to be seen. Lady Serafini knelt beside Morgana, holding the dying queen's hand, offering what comfort could be offered in those final moments. She whispered promises that she might or might not keep, vows to preserve what Morgana had accomplished, to ensure that the curse remained broken and that the kingdom learned to exist without feeding upon darkness. Serafini knew that she herself might be called upon to take responsibility for guiding the realm through the chaos that would inevitably follow, and part of her relished the possibility while another part feared it deeply. Power had always been her desire, but power of this magnitude, built upon such terrible foundations even in their destruction, carried burdens she was only beginning to understand. Commander Thorne approached the fallen king, checking for pulsing breathing, relieved to find both present even if weak and irregular. He had soldiers carefully lift Alfa and carry him to the royal chambers where healers could attend to him, though what healing could address wounds that went beyond merely physical damage remained an open question. Thorne himself was reeling from everything that had occurred, from the revelation of the curse to the destruction of a man he had considered his closest friend, but duty gave him structure and purpose when nothing else remained. He would see the kingdom through this night and the terrible days that would follow, would maintain order as best he could while those with greater wisdom than his own decided what form the realm should take going forward. As dawn began to break over the kingdom, light streaming through the throne room's high windows and illuminating the destruction in the blood and the shattered scene, it became clear that this was both an ending and a beginning. The age of the cursed kings had concluded in fiery revelation, but what would follow remained uncertain, shaped by choices that hundreds and thousands of individuals would make in the coming days and months and years. The kingdom had been given an opportunity for genuine change, for building something that did not depend upon hidden darkness in controlled monstrosity, but whether its people would rise to the challenge or simply recreate the same systems under different names was far from guaranteed. Morgana died as the sun rose, her hand still held by Serafini, her eyes fixed upon light that streamed through shattered stone. Her last words were too quiet for anyone but Serafini to hear, something about hope in sacrifice in the price the truth always demanded. And then she was gone, the woman who had dared to challenge the foundations of a kingdom and who had paid for the courage with everything she possessed. History would remember her as hero or villain, or perhaps both, as the queen who destroyed a realm or the savior who freed each from chains each had worn for so long that they had come to seem natural and necessary. King Alfa woke 3 days later in his chambers, weak and disoriented, his memories of the ritual fragmented and dreamlike. He could feel the absence within himself, the empty spaces where the Carsi had lived, and that absence was both liberation and loss. Part of him had been burned away along with the darkness, aspects of his personality, and his power that could never be recovered, and he would spend the rest of his reign learning to be a different kind of king, one who ruled without the terrible strength that the Carsi had provided but also without its corruption and demands. The kingdom adapted slowly to its new reality, processing the revelation of the Carsi and struggling to understand what each meant for their past and their future. There were those who mourned the loss of the old certainties, who felt vulnerable without the dark power that had protected them from enemies and maintained internal order, and there were those who celebrated the liberation from a system they had always sensed was profoundly wrong even if they had not understood its true nature. Conflicts erupted between these factions, sometimes violent, as different visions for the kingdom's future clashed in streets and housing battlefields. Lord Vesper was quietly removed from his position, retiring to a remote estate where he lived out his remaining years in bitter contemplation of everything he had believed in, everything he had protected. Commander Thorne accepted a position as Lord Protector, a new office created to provide military leadership without tying it to the throne and making it dependent upon royal authority. Lady Serafini, as men had suspected, emerged as one of the most influential figures in the realm, though she claimed no formal title, preferring to work through networks of alliances and obligations that gave her power without making her a target for those who resented the changes that had been forced upon them. The throne room itself was never fully repaired, the shattered seal left as a reminder of what had been revealed and destroyed that night. Pilgrims came from across the kingdom to see the place where Morgana had broken the Carsi, some viewing it as a sacred site, and others as a warning of the dangers of challenging traditions that had endured for centuries. The debates continued endlessly, in taverns, in temples, in council chambers, about whether Morgana had been right to do what she did, whether the cost had been worth the benefit, whether the kingdom was better or worse for having its greatest secret exposed, in purge. King Alfa ruled for another 15 years after the breaking of the Carsi, and those years were marked by constant struggle as he attempted to rebuild the kingdom's identity without the dark foundation that had supported it for so long. He faced rebellions from nobles who had prospered under the old system, assassination attempts from fanatics who believed the Carsi should have been preserved, and the constant challenge of maintaining authority without the supernatural power that previous kings had wielded. He remarried eventually, to a woman from a minor noble house who had no connection to the old conspiracies, and together they worked to establish new traditions that did not require darkness to sustain them. Some of his policies succeeded while others failed spectacularly, but he never stopped trying to prove that a kingdom could exist without feeding upon the suffering of its people, without requiring monsters to wear crowns. The question of succession haunted Alfa throughout those final years of his reign, for he and his new queen had no children, and the bloodline that had carried the Carsi for generations would end with him. There were those who argued that this was for the best, that a complete break with the past required new blood on the throne, while others feared that without the continuity of dynasty, the kingdom would fracture into competing factions, each claiming legitimacy for their own preferred candidate. Alfa himself seemed uncertain, sometimes favoring the establishment of an elected council to rule after his death, and other times supporting the claim of a distant cousin whose connection to the cursed bloodline was attenuated enough that they might avoid any lingering taint. Commander Thorne remained Alfa's most trusted advisor despite everything that had happened, perhaps because he understood better than anyone else what the king had lost and what he was trying to become. The two men who had been friends and brothers in arms now existed in a more complicated relationship, marked by the knowledge of what Alfa had been and what he had been capable of when the Carsi held sway. There were nights when they sat together in silence, drinking wine and staring at fires that burned the ordinary hearts with ordinary flames, both of them knowing that the bond they had once shared could never be fully restored but unwilling to abandon what remained. Thorne never married, never seemed to want anything beyond his duty to protect the kingdom and help guide each through the transition to whatever each was becoming, and when he died in his sleep at the age of 67, the entire realm mourned the loss of a man who had represented stability and honor during the most chaotic period in its history. Lady Serafini proved to be exactly as ambitious, incapable as everyone had suspected, and also more principled than men had feared. She used her influence to push for reforms that redistributed power away from the traditional aristocracy and toward guilds and merchant councils that had previously been excluded from governance. Her motives were never entirely pure, for she benefited tremendously from the new economic systems that emerged, but the results were undeniably beneficial for men who had suffered under the old order. She established schools that taught reading and mathematics to children regardless of their birth status, arguing that a kingdom needed educated citizens if each was to compete with its neighbors, maintain prosperity. Some accused her of simply creating a new form of control to replace the old one, of using knowledge in commas as chains instead of courses in violence, but she responded that at least her chains could be broken by individual effort rather than requiring someone to sacrifice themselves to shadow supernatural beings. The other kingdoms and empires that surrounded Alfa's realm watched the unfolding transformation with great interest and considerable concern. Some saw opportunity in what they perceived as weakness, and a kingdom that had voluntarily surrendered the source of its strength was now vulnerable to external pressure or invasion. Raiders struck at border settlements, testing whether the removal of the Carsi had truly diminished the kingdom's ability to defend itself, and were surprised to find that Commander Thorne's military reforms had actually made the realm's defenses more effective by relying on training and discipline rather than supernatural intimidation. Other neighboring rulers looked upon events with something like envy or hope, wondering if their own kingdoms carried similar secrets, and whether each might be possible to purge them without triggering the collapse that some men had predicted would befall Alfa's realm. Among the common people, reactions to Morgana's revelation and sacrifice varied enormously depending on personal experience and local conditions. In regions where the king's justice had been particularly harsh, where executions and purges had been frequent and brutal, the news that these acts had served not the kingdom but a Carsi was received with fury and calls for accountability. Riots broke out in several cities, with mobs attacking noble houses and burning symbols of royal authority, driven by rage at having been ruled by a monster and at the advisors and officials who had enabled that rule. In other areas where life had been relatively peaceful and prosperous, people were more inclined to view the Carsi as an unfortunate but manageable aspect of their history, something that had been dealt with it could now be moved past without excessive dwelling on past scenes. The Church, which had maintained an uneasy relationship with the royal family for generations, fractured into competing factions over how to interpret what had happened. Some priests declared that Morgana had been an agent of divine justice, sent to Pandinvon from the highest office in the land, and restore righteousness to the kingdom's foundation. Others condemned her as a practitioner of forbidden arts who had destroyed sacred traditions and exposed the realm to chaos and destruction. The theological debates became increasingly heated, occasionally spilling over into violence as different interpretations of doctrine and duty came into conflict. Eventually, the church itself is split into multiple denominations, each claiming to represent the true faith and each developing its own understanding of what the curse had meant and what Morgana's actions had accomplished or destroyed. Scholars and historians began the painstaking work of examining the kingdom's archives, searching for evidence of the curse's influence throughout the centuries. What they found was both muddy and less damning than expected. The curse had certainly shaped policy and action in countless ways, had pushed successive kings toward decisions that served darkness rather than light, but each had not been the solely determining factor in the kingdom's history. There had been moments of genuine compassion and justice even during the reign of cursed monarchs, times when the human part of the king had asserted itself against the beast as he whispers and chosen mercy over cruelty. Conversely, men of the kingdom's worst atrocities could not be blamed entirely on supernatural influence, but reflected choices that humans were perfectly capable of making on their own. The curse had amplified and encouraged certain tendencies, but each had not created them from nothing, and that realization forced an uncomfortable reckoning with the truth that evil did not require supernatural sources to flourish. In the years following Morgana's death, a cult formed around her memory, particularly strong among women who had chafed under the restrictions and limitations imposed by traditional society. They viewed her as a symbol of power claimed rather than granted, of the willingness to sacrifice everything for truth and justice, and they worked to preserve her teachings about shadow walking and the manipulation of reality as deeper layers. The cult was neither entirely benevolent nor entirely malevolent, for its members ranged from genuine seekers of wisdom to opportunists who saw the disruption of established order as a chance to advance their own interests. Some kingdoms welcomed them while others drove them out as dangerous revolutionaries, and over time they became a fixture of the broader world, a constant reminder that the old certainties about power and authority and the natural order of things had been permanently disrupted. King Alfa's health began to fail in his final years, not from any supernatural cause but simply from the accumulated weight of everything he had endured. The purging of the curse had left damage that no amount of time could fully heal, gaps in his being that made him increasingly fragile as he aged. He became more withdrawn, spending long hours in meditation or walking the castle grounds alone, and those who saw him during this period reported that he seemed to be looking for something or perhaps waiting for someone. When visitors asked what he sought, he would sometimes speak of Morgana, wondering where she was now and whether she had found peace or merely oblivion. Other times he spoke of the beast, questioning whether each had truly been destroyed or had simply been dispersed into forms too subtle to detect, waiting for an opportunity to coalesce once more. On the anniversary of the night when the seal had been shattered, Alfa made a pilgrimage to the throne room and stood upon the broken binding for hours, motionless and silent, while guards and advisors waited anxiously to see what he intended. When he finally spoke, it was to declare that a monument should be erected in that very spot, not to commemorate the curse its breaking but to honor all those who had suffered under the weight of secrets too terrible to acknowledge. He wanted the kingdom to remember not just Morgana's sacrifice but the countless unnamed individuals who had died or been destroyed to feed the beast's appetite, whose pain had sustained a system that should never have been allowed to exist. The monument was completed 2 years later, a vast sculpture of intertwined light and shadow that captured something of the complexity of what had happened, refusing to present simple narratives of heroism or villainy. Lady Serafini visited the monument on the day of its dedication, standing before each for a long chiming contemplation. She had achieved most of what she had desired, had accumulated wealth and influence beyond what she had imagined possible in her youth, but she found herself thinking often of Morgana esse final moments, of the expression on the dying queen esse face as dawn broke over the throne room. There had been something in that expression that Serafini had spent years trying to understand, something that went beyond mere satisfaction at accomplishing a goal, even relief at escaping suffering. It had looked almost like a transcendence, as though Morgana had in that moment touched something that existed beyond the endless games of power and ambition that consumed most lives. Serafini wondered if she would ever know such a moment herself, or if the choices she had made had closed off that possibility forever. The question of what had happened to the Carse itself remained a source of debate and speculation. Morgana esse ritual had certainly destroyed its physical manifestation and severed its connection to Alfa esse bloodline, but some scholars argued that power of their magnitude could not simply cease to exist, that it must have been transformed or redistributed in ways that were not immediately apparent. There were reports from various parts of the kingdom of strange phenomena, of shadows that moved with apparent intelligence, of dreams that seemed to carry messages from something vastly ancient, of individuals who developed abilities or compulsions that echoed aspects of what the cursed kings had manifested. These reports were investigated thoroughly, and while most proved to be either fabrications or misunderstandings, a few remained genuinely inexplicable, suggesting that perhaps the Carse's destruction had been less complete than Morgana had believed or hoped. Alfa died on a winter morning, quietly and without drama, attended only by his wife and a single physician. His last words were reportedly an apology, though to whom and for what was never entirely clear. Some believed he was apologizing to Morgana for failing to break free of the Carse on his own, for requiring her sacrifice to accomplish what he should have been strong enough to do himself. Others thought he might have been apologizing to his kingdom for all the years of hidden horror, or to the beast itself for destroying something that had been part of him for his entire life. His wife claimed that he seemed at peace in his final moments, that whatever burden he had carried had finally been lifted, and perhaps that was true, or perhaps it was simply what she wanted to believe. The succession crisis that had been anticipated for years finally materialized with Alfa's death, as multiple factions put forward candidates in arguments for why their vision of the kingdom esse futuri should prevail. Commander Thorn, who might have seized power through military force if he had been so inclined, instead worked tirelessly to broker compromises and ensure that the transition proceeded through negotiation rather than violence. The solution that eventually emerged was unprecedented: a council of representatives drawn from different regions and social classes, with a rotating chair rather than a permanent monarch. It was messy and inefficient and required constant negotiation, but it had the advantage of not concentrating power in a single individual who might become corrupted by it or who might carry hidden curses in their bloodline. Lady Serafini served on that first council, using her political skills to navigate the endless complexities of collective governance. She found it exhausting and frequently frustrating, but also strangely satisfying in ways that her previous pursuit of individual power had never been. There was something meaningful about having to convince others rather than simply imposing her will, about building consensus rather than dominating through superior position or resources. She wondered sometimes if this was what Morgana had envisioned when she broke the Carse, this chaotic but genuine attempt to distribute authority in ways that prevented any single person or entity from accumulating the kind of power that could threaten the realm's fundamental well-being. Decades passed, and the generation that had witnessed the breaking of the Carse gradually died off, replaced by those who knew it only through stories and histories. The kingdom continued to evolve, developing new traditions e new problems, facing challenges that had nothing to do with ancient curses or shadow beasts. Trade flourished, arts and sciences advanced, in life for most people improved in tangible ways as reforms initiated in the chaos following Morgana's revelation slowly took hold and produced results. The kingdom was not perfect, was not free from corruption or injustice or suffering, but each was perhaps more honest about its flaws and more willing to address them than each had been when darkness ruled from behind a throne. The monument to those who had suffered under the curse became a gathering place for people seeking justice or change, a symbol of the possibility that even the most deeply rooted evils could be confronted and overcome. Activists and reformers held rallies there, artists created works inspired by its themes of sacrifice and transformation, and ordinary citizens came to reflect on the nature of power and responsibility and the cost of truth. It became, over time, more important than any royal tomb or ceremonial hall, a living part of the kingdom as the ongoing conversation with itself about what each wanted there be and how each would get there. In distant lands, tales of Morgana and Alfa spread and transformed, becoming legends that bore only passing resemblance to the actual events. In some versions, Morgana was a demon who had destroyed a righteous king out of jealousy and ambition. In others, Alfa was a pure hero who had sacrificed himself to save his people from a curse imposed by external enemies. Yet still others, both of them were tragic figures caught in circumstances beyond their control, doomed by fate to play out roles e a drama that predated their births. The truth, as truth so often does, became less important than the meanings that different cultures and communities found in the stories they told themselves. The cult of shadow walkers that had formed around Morgana's memory grew and evolved, developing into something like a religious order or perhaps a school of mystical philosophy. They taught that power always carried costs and that those who sought to wield it had to be willing to pay those costs personally rather than extracting them from others. They practiced disciplines designed to bring practitioners into contact with the deeper layers of reality, believing that Morgana had discovered something profound about the nature of existence and that her methods could be adapted and applied to other contexts and purposes. Some kingdoms welcomed them as sources of wisdom and unusual perspectives, while others banned them as dangerous radicals who threatened social stability. And the shadow walkers learned to adapt to whatever environment they found themselves in, maintaining their core teachings while adjusting their external presentations. A century after the breaking of the curse, a young scholar discovered previously unknown documents in an abandoned monastery, journals that appear to have been written by Morgana herself during the years when she was preparing for her confrontation with the beast. The journals revealed the depth of her research and the extent of her doubts, showing a woman who was far more uncertain and conflicted than legends had portrayed. She had questioned constantly whether she had the right to make decisions that would affect so many lives, whether the cure she intended might prove worse than the disease, whether there might be alternative approaches she had not considered. But ultimately, she had concluded that allowing the curse to continue was a greater evil than any risk involved in attempting to destroy it, that inaction in the face of injustice was itself a form of complicity. The journals became the subject of intense study and debate, for they contained detailed descriptions of shadow-walking techniques and theoretical frameworks for understanding how reality could be manipulated at its deepest levels. Some attempted to recreate Morgana's methods, with varying degrees of success and occasional catastrophic failures that resulted in deaths or permanent alterations to individuals' or locations. The council that governed the kingdom imposed restrictions on such experiments, requiring oversight in safety protocols, but they did not ban the research entirely, recognizing that Morgana's knowledge represented a resource that might prove valuable in addressing future threats or challenges. As the second century after the Carciesi breaking approached its end, a new crisis emerged when archaeological expeditions in the mountains beyond the kingdom's borders discovered ruins that predated recorded history, including inscriptions that seemed to reference the same entity that had become the Shadow Beast. These inscriptions suggested that the Carci had been only one manifestation of something far larger and more ancient, a force and intelligence that had touched multiple civilizations across vast spans of time, always seeking vessels through which it could manifest and exert influence. The implications were disturbing, suggesting that Alpha S. Carci had been merely a single strand in a web that stretched across the world and perhaps beyond it. The kingdom dispatched scholars and shadow walkers to investigate these ruins, hoping to learn more about the nature of what they had faced and perhaps discover whether Morgana's victory had been as complete as believed. What they found was both reassuring and troubling. The entity that had become the Carci had indeed been destroyed in the way that mattered most, its connection to Alpha's bloodline severed permanently and its accumulated power dispersed. However, the underlying force from which it had originally derived remained extant, existing in some realm, a dimension adjacent to ordinary reality, and it continued to seek ways to manifest and influence the material world. Other kingdoms and other bloodlines might carry their own versions of the Carci, or might be vulnerable to becoming new vessels if they were not vigilant against such corruption. This discovery led to a remarkable period of international cooperation as different realms shared information about their own histories and secrets, comparing notches and trying to identify common patterns that might indicate the presence of similar courses or vulnerabilities. Not all kingdoms were willing to be so transparent, of course. Some actively worked to prevent investigations that might expose uncomfortable truths about the sources of their own power and authority. But enough participated to create a network of knowledge and mutual support, a collective effort to prevent future manifestations of the same kind of corruption that had plagued Alpha's lineage. The kingdom that Alfa and Morgana had ruled and transformed became a center for this research and cooperation, its experience with confronting and purging a Carci giving it unique credibility and expertise. The monument in the throne room became a pilgrimage site for visitors from across the known world, people who came to see the place where one woman had dared to challenge the foundations of power and had succeeded in breaking them despite the terrible cost. In that way, Morgana's sacrifice continued to have meaning and impact long after her death, inspiring others to look honestly at the systems they lived within and to ask difficult questions about whether those systems truly served the people they claimed to protect. In the end, the story of Alfa and Morgana became not just a historical event but a perpetual challenge, a reminder that truth always carried costs and that hiding from uncomfortable realities only allowed them to fester and grow more dangerous. The kingdom they had left behind was far from perfect, it still struggled with injustice and corruption and all the ordinary failures that human societies were prone to. But it had at least learned to face those failures honestly rather than burying them beneath layers of tradition and secrecy. And perhaps that was the greatest gift that Morgana's sacrifice had given them, not freedom from evil or corruption, for such freedom was likely impossible, but the encouraging tools to confront those things directly whenever they emerge, to burn them away before they could take root in the foundations of power and become impossible to remove without destroying everything. The throne room remained unrepaired, the shattered seal visible as a permanent scar, and generations of children grew up playing in its shadows, learning the story of what had happened there and understanding in their bones that no power was so great that it could not be challenged, no secret so dark that it could not be exposed, and no Carci so deeply rooted that it could not be broken by those willing to pay the necessary price. In that understanding, carried forward through time by countless individuals who would never be remembered by name or honored with monuments, the true legacy of the terrible night when Morgana shattered the seal, freed the shadow beast endured, a light that continued burning long after its source had been consumed.